Imagine this. You are 19 years old, and you have just been married for 6 hours. You are standing in a hotel room in Brighton, and you do not know what is supposed to happen next. Not vaguely, not shyly. You genuinely, truly do not know. No one has told you. Your mother kissed your forehead this morning and said only, "Be good and let him lead." That was the entire lesson. That was all the preparation an entire childhood had given you for tonight. It is strange to think about now, under your warm blanket in your own soft century. But for a Victorian bride, her wedding night was often the very first time anyone had explained, or failed to explain, anything at all about what marriage actually meant physically between two people. Hi friends. Tonight, we're easing gently into one of the quieter, stranger corners of the Victorian world. Not battles, not kings, just two ordinary young people in a rented room, both terrified, both silent, both far too polite to say so. Wherever you're tuning in from tonight, I'd love to know. Type it below, along with what time it is where you are right now. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe it's early. Either way, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Pull your blanket up. Let your shoulders drop. And if you find yourself enjoying tonight's slow little journey, a quiet like or subscribe helps this channel more than you'd think, but only if it feels right. No pressure at all. For now, let's just settle in and drift gently back to a bedroom in 1861. You have to understand something about the world your bride is standing in. In most respectable Victorian households, sexuality simply was not discussed. Not once, not in passing. A mother might spend 18 years teaching her daughter how to embroider a handkerchief, how to pour tea without a sound, how to curtsy to a duchess, and never once mention what would happen on her wedding night. It wasn't cruelty, exactly, it was fear. Fear that knowledge would somehow taint a young woman's purity, fear that speaking of such things aloud was itself indecent, even between mother and daughter, even behind a closed door. So brides arrived at their wedding nights, carrying nothing but rumor. And rumor, in the Victorian world, was a strange and frightening teacher. Some girls believed, genuinely believed, that childbirth and intimacy were the same event, arriving on the same night. Others had absorbed only fragments from novels, which tended to fade to black at exactly the wrong moment, or from whispered warnings passed between cousins at family gatherings. Half giggled, half terrified, entirely unclear. There's a soft, sad kind of comedy in it if you squint. Imagine spending your whole life being taught precisely how to fold linen, precisely how to address a bishop, precisely how many inches of lace was appropriate on a morning dress, while the single most significant night of your adult life arrived with absolutely no instructions at all. Listen closely, and you can almost hear the room. A gas lamp hissing softly in the corner, the creak of floorboards as your new husband, himself likely only a few years older, and often just as uninformed as you, moves quietly across the room. Outside, church bells somewhere in the distance mark the hour, slow and even, utterly indifferent to what is happening inside. A carriage passes on the cobblestones below, its wheels rattling faintly, then fading. You are wearing your nightgown, which took 11 minutes just to unbutton, because Victorian nightwear was, in its own way, an entire architectural project. Layers upon layers, buttoned wrist to throat, high collars even for bed, as though modesty needed guarding 24 hours a day, including while unconscious. There's something almost tender in how impractical it all was. A wedding night, of all nights, wrapped in more fabric than a winter coat. Doctors of the era did not help matters much. Many respected physicians published medical guidance suggesting that excessive intimacy in marriage could damage a woman's nervous system, weaken a man's constitution, or, in truly astonishing texts, shorten one's lifespan altogether. One popular medical writer of the mid-1800s advised married couples to limit such moments to no more than once a month, for the sake of their health. Imagine receiving that as your only piece of premarital advice. Not tenderness, not comfort, but a warning, delivered with the same gravity as advice about eating too much red meat. And so, on many wedding nights, what should have been simply awkward instead became something closer to frightening. Historians studying letters and diaries from the period have found brides describing their wedding nights not with romance, but with words like ordeal, shock, and more than once, simply, I cried. Not from sorrow exactly, from confusion, from exhaustion, from the sheer quiet terror of not understanding what was happening to your own body in a room lit only by a single low flame, with a near stranger you had, in most cases, met only a handful of times before the wedding itself. Because that's another detail worth sitting gently under your blanket tonight for a great many Victorian couples, particularly in the upper and upper middle classes. Marriage was not built on months of easy familiarity. Courtships were short, heavily chaperoned, and carefully monitored. A young woman might spend perhaps a dozen supervised afternoons with the man she was to marry, always with an aunt nearby, always with the drawing room door left slightly ajar, always within careful earshot of someone older and more watchful. She would know his handwriting from his letters. She would know his opinions on poetry, perhaps, or his views on the church. She would very likely not know the sound of his voice at midnight, or the shape of his hands in low lamplight, or anything at all about what it felt like to simply be alone with him behind a closed door. So picture it again, softly, two young people. A rented room above a quiet Brighton street, chosen because it was respectable, because it had a sea view, because that was simply what one did. A single candle, or perhaps the newer luxury of gaslight, casting long gold shadows across wallpaper patterned with tiny repeating flowers. The distant endless hush of waves outside, rolling in, retreating, rolling in again, patient, unbothered, entirely unaware of the quiet panic happening 2 floors above the shoreline. There's a small, dry irony worth noticing here, one that historians of the period often mention with a knowing little smile. The wealthier and more proper a family was, the less prepared their daughters tended to be. Working-class women, who often lived in single-room homes, shared with parents, siblings, sometimes livestock, usually had at least some passive, accidental understanding of intimacy, simply through proximity and overheard household life. Wealthy young women, tucked away in spacious homes with governesses and separate wings and locked bedroom doors, were sometimes the very last to know anything at all. Privacy, in this one particular way, became its own kind of ignorance. Isn't that strange? All that space, all that comfort, all those rules meant to protect, and in the end, protection simply became silence. Some mothers did try, in their own careful, roundabout way. There are letters, soft, apologetic, half-finished letters, where a mother attempts clumsily to explain marital duty to her daughter the morning of the wedding, using a language so vague and so heavily coded that daughters often finished reading them no more informed than before. One surviving letter, paraphrased gently rather than quoted, describes a mother telling her daughter simply to submit gracefully and trust that nature would guide her. Nature, apparently, was expected to do quite a lot of the talking that Victorian parents could not bring themselves to do, and so many wedding nights unfolded not in romance, but in a strange, tender kind of mutual bewilderment. 2 young people, both raised inside the same wall of silence, both equally unprepared, both trying desperately to appear calm for the sake of the other. There is something almost sweet in that, even now. Not romantic in the way we'd usually mean it, but human. 2 frightened people, sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed, listening to a clock somewhere in the hallway tick steadily onward, neither one certain what to do first, both far too polite to admit it out loud. By morning, most brides simply got up, dressed, slowly, carefully, back into all those layers, and went down to breakfast as though nothing at all had happened. That was, in its own quiet way, the entire Victorian approach to intimacy. Endure it privately, never discuss it publicly, and let breakfast continue exactly on schedule. Tea poured, toast buttered, newspaper folded neatly beside the plate, life resuming its calm, ordinary rhythm, as if the night before had simply been a page quietly turned and never mentioned again. Confused and somehow expected to carry on anyway. Imagine standing perfectly still while 3 other people dress you, not helping you dress, dressing you entirely, as though you were a doll being prepared for display. This was simply how a Victorian bride's wedding day began, long before any wedding night discomfort arrived. Still tired from the excitement of the morning, still nervous, still yours. But not, for these few hours, quite in control of your own body, let's ease gently back into the story. A Victorian wedding day, for a bride of any real standing, could take 4 or 5 hours of physical preparation alone. There was the corset first, laced tightly enough to shape the torso into the fashionable narrow silhouette of the era, sometimes reducing the natural waist by several inches. Then came layers of petticoats, sometimes 5 or 6 at once, each one slightly stiffer than the last, designed to give the wedding gown its correct, imposing shape. Then the gown itself, often 40 or 50 pounds of fabric, beading and trim, requiring 2 people simply to lift it over the bride's head without disturbing her hair. And her hair, that was its own quiet ordeal. Elaborate Victorian wedding hairstyles could take 2 hours alone, pinned, curled, powdered, and threaded with ribbon or fresh flowers, held in place with dozens of small pins that would by the end of the night leave faint red marks along the scalp. There is a soft, dry humor in imagining a bride, hours later, alone at last with her new husband, gently wincing as she finally removes the last of 50 hairpins. The most physically dramatic moment of her wedding night being, quite literally, her own hairstyle surrendering to gravity. By the time evening finally arrived, many brides were quite simply exhausted, not emotionally, physically. Their bodies had spent all day being laced, pinned, buttoned, and arranged like furniture. It's a detail rarely mentioned in old romantic paintings of Victorian weddings, how tired the bride's body actually was by nightfall. Historians studying wedding day diaries have noted brides describing their feet aching from hours of standing, their ribs sore from the corset, their scalp tender from the pins. Arriving at their wedding night not glowing with romance, but quietly, physically spent. There's the sound of it, too, if you let yourself imagine it. The soft rustle of heavy silk moving across a wooden floor, the faint creak of stays being unlaced, one hook at a time, a single sigh of relief as a corset finally loosens, ribs expanding fully for what might be the first time since sunrise. Somewhere below, in the hotel or family home, muted laughter drifts up from a wedding party still lingering downstairs, unaware that the bride upstairs is simply trying, gently, to breathe. And then there was the room itself. Even wealthy Victorian bedrooms, by our standards, were often surprisingly cold and surprisingly small. Central heating simply did not exist. A single fireplace might warm one corner of a room, while the rest remained genuinely, bitterly cold. Enough that brides sometimes wore knitted bed jackets over their nightgowns, layering warmth exactly where romance might have preferred bare skin. It's almost comic, in a soft, forgivable way. An entire elaborate wedding night, quietly undermined by a fireplace that simply wasn't doing its job. Beds, too, were often smaller and firmer than we'd expect. Many mid-century mattresses were stuffed with horsehair or straw, providing a level of comfort somewhere between acceptable and you'll manage. Wealthy homes might afford a feather mattress, softer and warmer, but even then, sheets were often changed only once a week, and blankets, heavy, woolen, and none too fragrant by modern standards, were considered simply how things were. If the couple were on honeymoon, staying at a hotel or seaside inn, things could be even less private than we might imagine. Walls were often thin. Servants moved through hallways at odd hours, tending fires, refilling water jugs, delivering final trays of tea. A honeymoon night wasn't always the hushed, isolated experience we picture. It might be interrupted by a soft knock, a servant's apologetic voice through the door, a distant clatter of dishes being cleared 2 rooms away. Real privacy, the kind we take entirely for granted now, was a much rarer and more fragile thing in 1860. There's a quiet detail from several honeymoon travel diaries of the period that's almost tender to imagine. Many newly married couples spent their wedding night not in some grand romantic suite, but in perfectly ordinary rented rooms, chosen for practicality, proximity to a train station, a reasonable nightly rate, a landlady with a respectable reputation. One bride, writing years later about her own wedding night, recalled mostly the sound of a train whistle from a nearby station, and how strange it felt to be married and still hear something so ordinary happening just outside the window. Money mattered here too, in small, quiet ways. A modest middle-class couple might spend the equivalent of an entire week's household budget on a 2-night honeymoon stay. A real financial stretch, undertaken simply because tradition expected it. Wealthier families could afford weeks away, sometimes touring the continent for a month or more. But even among the wealthy, comfort as we'd define it, warm rooms, soft beds, real privacy, was inconsistent at best. And still, through all of this, the exhaustion, the cold, the thin walls, the 50 hairpins, slowly working themselves loose, there was an expectation that everything should feel, somehow, romantic. Magazines and etiquette guides of the era spoke of the wedding night in soft, vague, flowery language, the sacred beginning, the tender threshold, language that promised warmth and meaning while offering absolutely no practical comfort whatsoever. It is, in its own gentle way, one of history's small, quiet absurdities, an entire culture built around describing a moment beautifully, while doing almost nothing to make the moment itself comfortable. Perhaps that's part of why so many wedding night diary entries, when they exist at all, are so brief, not because nothing happened, but because so much of what happened was simply logistics. Cold rooms, tight corsets, thin walls, tired feet, dressed up afterward, in memory, as something more poetic than it actually felt at the time. There's something almost comforting in that, oddly. We tend to imagine the past as grander and more graceful than our own ordinary lives. But so often it was just as tired, just as improvised, just as human as anything we might experience ourselves. By the time the candle finally burned low and the last hairpin was finally set aside on the nightstand, most brides were simply ready for the day to be over. Not disappointed necessarily, just human, tired, and somehow still hers. Imagine spending 11 afternoons with a man, always chaperoned, always in a drawing room, always with the door left carefully open, and then being expected to share not just a bedroom with him, but an entire life. For many Victorian brides, especially in the middle and upper classes, this wasn't an exaggeration. It was simply how courtship worked. Let's drift gently back into it. Marriage in much of Victorian society was rarely built on the kind of long, casual familiarity we take for granted now. There was no dating in our sense of the word, no quiet dinners alone, no long walks without a watchful relative several steps behind. Courtship was, by design, a supervised, carefully paced process, meant to protect a young woman's reputation. Above almost everything else, even at the cost of her actually getting to know the man she'd soon be sharing a bed with for the rest of her life. A respectable courtship might unfold like this. A young man is introduced at a dance, or through family connections, or at church. If both families approve, he may be permitted to call on her, always in the presence of a parent, an aunt, or an older sibling. These visits typically lasted no more than an hour. Conversation stayed carefully within safe boundaries. Weather, books, perhaps a shared acquaintance. Physical contact, beyond a gloved handshake, was essentially unthinkable before engagement, and often remained minimal even after. Letters helped a little. Many courting couples wrote to each other between visits, and these letters, more private, less supervised, sometimes carried a bit more warmth and personality than the stiff drawing-room conversations allowed. But even letters were expected to remain within the bounds of propriety. A young woman's letters might even be read, occasionally, by a watchful mother, just to be sure everything was suitable. By the time a couple actually married then, they often knew each other's manners far better than each other's selves. He would know she liked strong tea and disliked the color yellow. She would know he preferred sermons short and walks long, but the countless small physical realities of another human being, the sound of his breathing at night, the particular warmth of his hands, the exact rhythm of how he moved through a room when no one was watching. These were almost entirely unknown until the wedding night itself delivered them, all at once without warning. There is something quietly touching in this, if you sit with it gently. Two people meeting properly, truly, for the very first time, not at the altar, but afterward, alone, in a room with the door finally closed. All the formality of courtship simply dissolving into two very young, very nervous strangers trying to figure out, together, what came next. Abinge made this even more delicate. Many Victorian brides married young, commonly between 18 and 23 among the middle and upper classes, though marriages could occur earlier, especially in aristocratic circles where alliances and inheritance mattered more than personal readiness. Grooms tended to be a few years older, sometimes considerably older, particularly in cases where a wealthy older widower remarried a much younger woman. Historians have found marriage records where the age gap between bride and groom exceeded 20 years, arrangements considered entirely unremarkable at the time, simply a practical matter of a man having, by his 40s, finally accumulated enough income to properly support a household. Imagine, gently, what that particular wedding night might have felt like. An 18-year-old bride and a groom old enough to be her father, both bound now by a single quiet ceremony, both expected to simply proceed as though the gap between them didn't exist at all. Sound played its part here too. In a house with thin walls and watchful servants, sound was one of the few things that couldn't be fully controlled. The creak of a floorboard, the soft click of a door latch, a distant cough from a nearby room, reminding both bride and groom that they were never quite as alone as the moment demanded. Some Victorian homes were large enough for genuine privacy. Many were not. Servants slept in nearby quarters, sometimes directly above or below the master bedroom, and the etiquette of pretending not to hear anything became, in its own quiet way, a skill every household servant was expected to master. There's a dry little irony worth pausing on here. The entire Victorian system of courtship was built, meticulously, around protecting a young woman's modesty right up until her wedding day, and then, almost instantly, expected her to abandon all of that carefully constructed modesty in a single evening, with a man she barely knew, in a house full of people carefully pretending not to notice. It's the kind of contradiction that, if you think about it slowly enough, under a warm blanket, becomes almost funny. All that chaperoning, all that careful distance, all building toward one night where all of it simply had to stop, all at once, with no transition whatsoever. Some couples managed this transition with surprising tenderness. Letters and diaries from happier marriages describe wedding nights approached with quiet patience. Husbands who, sensing their bride's nervousness, simply talked with her for hours instead, or read aloud from a favorite book, letting the strangeness settle slowly rather than all at once. These accounts are gentler to read, softer somehow, small quiet proof that kindness could exist, even inside a system built on silence and unfamiliarity. Others were more difficult. Some brides described their wedding nights, in careful, restrained Victorian language, as simply something to be endured, a duty performed quietly, then set aside and rarely discussed again. It would be wrong to pretend every Victorian marriage handled that first night with warmth. Many simply didn't, not out of cruelty, necessarily, but out of the same silence that had shaped the whole courtship. Two people doing their quiet best with almost no guidance at all. And there's something worth remembering gently, here, before we drift onward. By the time morning came, whatever had or hadn't happened the night before, life simply continued. There were trunks to pack, if the honeymoon journey was beginning that day. There were thank you letters to write to wedding guests. There was a whole new household to begin managing, servants to properly introduce herself to, a husband's habits to slowly, quietly learn, not in one dramatic night, but across the following weeks and months and years, the way most real intimacy between two people actually grows, slowly, unglamorously, one ordinary day at a time, nervous and somehow already beginning to learn each other. Imagine reaching for the one book in the house meant to explain everything, and finding only a single vague paragraph wrapped in so much careful, flowery language that you finish reading it no wiser than before you started. This was the quiet, frustrating reality for many Victorian brides, who did try to seek out guidance. The knowledge existed, technically. It simply wasn't written in any language that actually helped. Let's settle in gently for this last part of tonight's journey. By the mid to late Victorian period, a small handful of marriage advice manuals had begun to appear, modest little books with titles like Advice to a Wife or The Young Bride's Companion, sold quietly, often wrapped in plain paper, occasionally purchased by an embarrassed mother on behalf of an equally embarrassed daughter. These books promised guidance. What they usually delivered was mostly moral instruction: patience, obedience, gentleness, the importance of a calm household. Genuinely useful advice for marriage in general, but almost entirely silent on the actual physical realities of a wedding night itself. When these manuals did address intimacy, even briefly, the language was almost comically indirect. Historians who've studied these texts describe authors reaching for euphemism after euphemism rather than plain description. Soft phrases about wifely duty, about yielding gently to nature's design, about trusting that all would become clear in time. One can imagine a nervous young bride, candle in hand, reading these lines twice, then 3 times, hoping for some hidden clarity that simply never surfaces. Doctors, as we touched on earlier tonight, weren't much more forthcoming, and when they did speak plainly, it often wasn't reassurance so much as caution. Medical texts of the era occasionally warned that too much intimacy could lead to nervous exhaustion, or advised newlyweds to wait several days, or even weeks after the wedding itself before consummating the marriage, allowing the bride's constitution, as one widely circulated guide phrased it, time to properly adjust. Imagine that quiet, strange kindness, a formal medical suggestion that a frightened young woman simply be given a little more time before anyone expected anything at all of her. Whether every household actually followed such advice is another question entirely, but its mere existence tells us something gentle about how widely understood this fear and confusion really was. There's a small, wry irony worth sitting with here, too. This was, after all, an era utterly obsessed with education. Girls were taught French, watercolor painting, piano, the proper etiquette for 17 different types of social calls. And yet the single most significant physical transition of a young woman's adult life was left almost entirely to chance, rumor, and a badly written pamphlet purchased in embarrassed silence. It's the kind of quiet historical contradiction that, said gently enough under a warm blanket, tends to land as genuinely funny. All that meticulous preparation poured into everything except the one thing that might have actually helped. Some households did find their own small workarounds. Older, more experienced female relatives, an aunt, occasionally a grandmother, sometimes took it upon themselves to have a quiet, careful conversation with a bride shortly before her wedding, filling in at least a few of the gaps left by silence and vague manuals. These conversations were rarely detailed by our standards, but they were often kinder and more practical than anything written down, simply because they came from lived experience rather than careful, anxious euphemism, and gradually, quietly, things did begin to shift. By the final decades of the Victorian era, a few more progressive voices, some doctors, a handful of early reform-minded writers, began advocating gently for more openness between husbands and wives, arguing that fear and confusion on a wedding night served no one, least of all a young marriage meant to last decades. Change, as it so often does, moved slowly, unevenly, more in scattered pockets of understanding than in any single sweeping shift. But it moved. For most brides in the middle of the century, though, the wedding night simply had to be survived largely alone, armed with a vague blessing from a mother, a euphemism-laden paragraph from a borrowed manual, and whatever quiet courage they could gather in the candlelight. And somehow, remarkably, most of them did survive it. Marriages continued. Households were built. Children were raised. Whatever awkwardness, fear, or confusion existed that very first night gradually, gently, softened into the slower, steadier intimacy that simply comes from years of shared mornings, shared meals, shared small ordinary days. There's something worth carrying gently with you as we drift towards sleep tonight. History often remembers grand things, wars, kings, revolutions, but it's these small, quiet human moments that tell us just as much about the past. A frightened young bride, a nervous young groom, a silent mother, a useless little manual wrapped in plain paper, purchased in embarrassed silence. All of it so far from our own world now, and yet somehow so recognizably, tenderly human. The candle is low now. The room is quiet. Somewhere outside, the wind moves gently through unseen trees, and a distant church bell marks another hour passing, slow and unhurried, exactly as it always has. Whatever confusion or nervousness once filled small rooms like this one has long since settled into history, softened by time, forgiven by distance, remembered now only as a quiet, gentle story told softly to help you drift off to sleep, confused once, forgiven by time, and now simply Cicely, a story, Salib. Well, friends, we'll meet again soon in another quiet corner of history.